In the industrial outskirts of Geneva, bordered by rail yards and highway overpasses, sits a cluster of unassuming gray warehouses. From the outside, the compound at La Praille looks like a distribution center for commercial electronics or pharmaceuticals. There are no marble columns, there are no grand staircases or bronze plaques. But past the perimeter fences, through the biometric checkpoints, the climate-controlled airlocks, and the seismic-proof steel doors, lies the greatest art collection in human history. It is estimated that 1.2 million individual artworks rest inside these walls. Picassos, Warhols, Rothkos, Da Vinci's, ancient Etruscan antiquities, and pristine Roman sculptures. The total estimated value approaches $100 billion. It is a museum richer than the Louvre, the Met, and the British Museum combined. But this museum has no visitors. The lights are kept off. The masterpieces remain sealed in custom-built wooden crates, wrapped in archival foam, unseen by human eyes for decades. This is the Geneva Freeport.
It is a highly secure logistics hub that operates under a unique legal classification, allowing privately owned property to be stored within a tax-free customs zone. It does not belong to the Swiss government, and the warehouse itself is perfectly legal. But over the last 40 years, this mundane storage facility has quietly evolved into the ultimate sanctuary for global wealth. It is a place where ultra-wealthy collectors, hedge fund managers, and oligarchs can buy, sell, and hoard cultural heritage indefinitely, without ever paying customs duties or sales taxes. The physical art never moves. The crates never leave the building. Only the names on offshore ledgers change hands. To the public, a painting is a visual experience, a piece of cultural history. But inside the Geneva Freeport, a painting is transformed into something entirely different. It becomes a bearer bond. It becomes a high-yield asset, completely detached from the physical world.
The transformation of this concrete bunker reveals exactly how the modern shadow economy operates, how the ultra-wealthy shield their capital from the state, and what happens when the most beautiful objects ever created by human hands are swallowed by the dark. To understand how a concrete bunker in Switzerland became the undisputed center of the shadow art market, you have to look at the legal fiction of transit. The Geneva Freeport was not designed for fine art. Established in 1888, its original purpose was agricultural and industrial. Train cars carrying grain, timber, tea, and manufactured goods would roll into the facility on their way across Europe. Because these goods were merely passing through Switzerland, the government declared the space a customs-free zone. As long as the goods remained inside the designated perimeter, they had not technically entered the country. Therefore, no import taxes or duties were owed. It was a temporary waiting room for global trade. For nearly a century, the system worked exactly as intended. But in the 1970s and 1980s, the mechanics of global wealth began to shift. Inflation, oil shocks, and volatile currency markets pushed the ultra-wealthy to seek safety in tangible assets. Gold, diamonds, and fine art became highly desirable stores of value. At the same time, European nations began implementing steep value-added taxes, or VAT, on luxury goods.
If a collector bought a $50 million painting in New York and imported it to London, they could face a 20% tax bill. $10 million owed immediately to the government, simply for moving a canvas across a border. The ultra-wealthy do not pay $10 million for the privilege of looking at a painting. They needed a loophole. And the Geneva Freeport, with its century-old agricultural transit laws, provided the perfect mechanism. The legal definition of transit did not specify a time limit. A sack of grain might sit in the Freeport for 3 days. A Monet could sit there for 30 years. Under Swiss law, both were treated exactly the same. Both were in perpetual transit. By the 1990s, the grain and timber were gone. The warehouses were retrofitted with state-of-the-art climate control, fire suppression systems that suck oxygen from the air without damaging canvas, and impenetrable vaults. The Geneva Freeport became an offshore tax haven that held physical objects instead of bank accounts. The financialization of art accelerated rapidly after the 2008 global financial crisis.
As central banks slashed interest rates to zero, capital flooded into alternative assets. Art was no longer an eccentric hobby, it was a primary pillar of wealth preservation. But unlike equities or real estate, the art market is aggressively opaque. There is no centralized exchange. There is no regulatory body overseeing pricing. There are no mandatory public disclosures of ownership. It is the last major unregulated market on Earth. The Freeport system supercharged this opacity. A billionaire could purchase a masterpiece at a Christie's auction in Manhattan using an anonymous shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands. The painting would be packed into a crate and flown directly to Geneva. From the tarmac, an armored truck would drive it straight into the Freeport. The paperwork would show that the artwork was in transit. It had not been imported. Therefore, no taxes were triggered. The shell company owned the asset, and the asset was legally nowhere. It existed in a sovereign blind spot. This mechanism created a profound incentive structure. The longer the art stayed in the Freeport, the more valuable it became as a tax-deferred asset.
Collectors stopped buying art to hang in their living rooms. They bought art to lock it in a box. Entire collections, spanning thousands of pieces and billions of dollars in value, were assembled without the owner ever seeing the physical objects in person. The warehouse expanded. The Swiss government, benefiting from the massive logistics and security contracts, largely looked the other way. The Geneva Freeport handled an estimated 40% of the global art market's physical volume. It was a perfect, frictionless machine for wealth preservation. But the machine required an operator. It required someone who understood both the physical logistics of moving priceless objects and the psychological demands of the billionaires who owned them. The system needed a king. By the early 2000s, the Geneva Freeport was expanding at an unprecedented rate, and it required a visionary to manage the influx of capital. That visionary was Yves Bouvier. A Swiss businessman who inherited a modest shipping company called Natural Le Coultre, Bouvier saw the future of the art market clearer than anyone else. He realized that the real money was not in merely transporting paintings. The real money was in controlling the sanctuary where the paintings lived. Bouvier aggressively modernized the Geneva facility. He built new wings, upgraded the security infrastructure to rival military installations, and cultivated deep relationships with the world's most secretive collectors. He understood that ultra-high net worth individuals demanded absolute discretion above all else. Under his guidance, Natural Le Coultre became the dominant tenant of the Geneva Freeport, essentially privatizing a massive portion of the Swiss customs zone. But Bouvier's ambition did not stop at storage. He recognized a structural inefficiency in the market. The people who owned the art rarely understood its true value, and the people who wanted to buy the art were desperate for access. Because Bouvier controlled the physical space, he knew exactly what was inside every crate. He knew who was desperate to sell and who was hungry to buy. He possessed the ultimate asymmetric information advantage. Bouvier quietly transformed himself from a logistics manager into a private art dealer. This dual role created a massive, hidden conflict of interest. He was trusted to independently store and appraise assets for his clients, while simultaneously acting as a broker who took a cut of the sales. His masterpiece was his relationship with Russian fertilizer oligarch Dmitry Rybolovlev. Rybolovlev was flush with billions of dollars in cash and wanted to build a world-class art collection to secure his wealth outside of Russia. He hired Bouvier to source the greatest masterpieces on the private market. Over the course of a decade, Bouvier procured 38 museum-quality artworks for Rybolovlev, including pieces by Picasso, Modigliani, and a painting attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, the Salvator Mundi. Rybolovlev spent approximately $2 billion on this collection. Almost all of it was routed directly into the Geneva Freeport. Bouvier presented himself as an agent, taking a standard 2% administrative fee for his services. But the reality was fundamentally different. Bouvier was not acting as a broker, he was acting as a principal. He would secretly buy a painting from a third party for $50 million, hold it in his own offshore company, and then sell it to Rybolovlev days later for $80 million, pocketing the $30 million difference. Because the transactions occurred within the opaque walls of the Freeport, There was no way for Rybolovlev to verify the original purchase price. The physical artwork never even moved from its vault. Only the paperwork shifted. Bouvier was allegedly extracting hundreds of millions of dollars in undisclosed markups, entirely shielded by the absolute secrecy of the Freeport system. It was a brilliant, flawless mechanism for wealth extraction. The incentives were perfectly aligned for everyone involved to keep quiet. The sellers got their money, Rybolovlev got his tax-free masterpieces, and Bouvier became immensely wealthy. But the fatal flaw in every hidden system is that it relies on total control of information.
And in 2014, the information leaked. The collapse of the Bouvier empire began with a casual conversation on a Caribbean beach. In late 2014, Dmitry Rybolovlev was vacationing in St. Bart's when he happened to meet Sandy Heller, a prominent art advisor who had previously represented the billionaire hedge fund manager Steve Cohen. They began discussing a specific painting, Modigliani's reclining nude with blue cushion. Rybolovlev proudly mentioned that he had recently purchased the masterpiece for $118 million. Heller was stunned. He knew for a fact that Steve Cohen had sold that exact painting to an anonymous buyer just months earlier for only $93 million. In an instant, the $25 million discrepancy was exposed. Rybolovlev realized that his trusted logistics manager, Yves Bouvier, had not been acting as a simple agent taking a 2% fee. Bouvier had been secretly flipping the art, capturing massive margins in the dark. The revelation triggered a brutal international legal war. In early 2015, Rybolovlev set a trap. He lured Bouvier to Monaco under the guise of finalizing another massive art purchase. When Bouvier arrived at the oligarch's Belle Epoque penthouse, Monaco police were waiting. Bouvier was arrested and charged with fraud and complicity in money laundering. He vehemently denied the charges, arguing that he was never Rybolovlev's agent, but an independent seller perfectly entitled to maximize his profit margins. The legal merit of the fraud allegations would be debated in courts across Monaco, Paris, Geneva, and Singapore for years. But the true casualty of the Bouvier affair was not one man's reputation. It was the secrecy of the entire Freeport system. The resulting lawsuits dragged the inner workings of the Geneva Freeport into the harsh light of global media and regulatory scrutiny. Court filings revealed the exact mechanics of a Freeport transaction. They showed how a $50 million asset could change hands multiple times in a single day, generating immense profits, while the physical object sat undisturbed in a wooden crate. The mechanism was elegantly simple. A buyer and seller would agree on a price. The buyer's offshore shell company would wire funds to the seller's offshore shell company.
Once the funds cleared, a representative at the Freeport would open a ledger and change the name of the entity authorized to access the vault. A forklift might move the crate from room A to room B, but often the crate did not move at all. Because the transaction occurred between two offshore entities and the physical asset remained within the customs-free zone, no sales tax was paid. No capital gains were reported. No sovereign government captured a single cent of revenue from the economic activity. Law enforcement agencies around the world watched the Bouvier disclosures with mounting alarm. The European Union and the United States Treasury Department began issuing reports highlighting Freeports as massive vulnerabilities in the global anti-money laundering framework. If you wanted to hide illicit wealth, buying a Picasso with dirty money and locking it in Geneva was vastly safer than trying to move cash through the heavily regulated banking system. The Swiss government, terrified of being blacklisted as a facilitator of financial crime, was forced to act. The era of unconditional secrecy was over.
In 2016, Switzerland implemented a new customs ordinance specifically targeting the Freeport loopholes. The new regulations demanded that Freeport managers maintain rigorous inventories, identifying the true beneficial owners of the goods stored in their vaults, piercing the veil of the offshore shell companies. More importantly, the Swiss mandated a strict 6-month time limit on goods claiming transit status. The perpetual parking lot was officially closed. Or at least that was the intention. In reality, the new rules contained a massive loophole. The
The 6-month limit could be extended indefinitely by Swiss customs authorities if the owner could provide a valid justification for keeping the art in storage. And for the ultra-wealthy, valid justifications are easy to manufacture. While the reporting requirements became stricter, the core mechanism survived. The art remained in the dark. But the pressure fundamentally altered the geography of the shadow market. As Geneva tightened its grip, the Freeport model fractured and spread globally. Competing tax-free storage facilities opened in Singapore, Luxembourg, Monaco, and Delaware.
The infrastructure of wealth preservation simply decentralized, moving to jurisdictions willing to offer the discretion that Switzerland was slowly dismantling. The conflict was no longer just between one oligarch and his dealer. It was a structural war between sovereign tax authorities trying to illuminate the movement of capital and a global elite determined to keep their assets invisible. And caught in the middle of this financial warfare were the masterpieces themselves, reduced to hostages in a game of regulatory arbitrage. The Geneva Freeport is not an anomaly. It is the purest physical manifestation of the modern global economy. Over the last 4 decades, the ultra-wealthy have run out of traditional places to park their capital. Bond yields compressed. Real estate became heavily taxed, highly visible, and politically sensitive. Bank secrecy was systematically dismantled by global regulators armed with data-sharing agreements. But physical objects remain uniquely difficult to trace. They cross borders in cargo holds. They sit silently in concrete rooms. The Freeport system took the oldest form of wealth, the ownership of beautiful things, and merged it with the architecture of modern offshore finance. The result is a paradox that defines our era. We are producing more wealth than at any point in human history, but that wealth is increasingly dematerialized, hidden, and separated from the societies that generated it. When a masterpiece enters a Freeport, it ceases to be a painting. It loses its context. It loses its ability to provoke, to inspire, or to communicate. It is stripped of its cultural function and reduced entirely to its financial utility. It becomes a line item on a balance sheet, perfectly preserved in a climate-controlled void. The tragedy of the Freeport is not merely the avoidance of taxes. The tragedy is the privatization of human heritage. The 1.2 million artworks locked in Geneva represent a staggering portion of our collective visual history. They are the defining expressions of genius from centuries past, and they have been removed from the public sphere, perhaps permanently. They will not hang in museums. They will not be studied by students. They exist only as collateral, as chips in a high-stakes game of asset allocation. The regulations introduced in 2016 forced a degree of transparency onto the Swiss system, but they did not change the underlying incentives. As long as capital seeks shelter from taxation and scrutiny, the demand for dark storage will only grow. The vaults in Singapore and Luxembourg are already expanding. The infrastructure of secrecy is highly adaptive. It responds to pressure by building thicker walls and more complex legal structures. The true legacy of the Geneva Freeport is the blueprint it created for the financialization of everything. If a Picasso can be transformed into a bearer bond, what else can be locked away and traded in the dark? We have built a global system that optimizes for the protection of capital above all other human endeavors. The physical reality of the crates in Geneva proves that this system works exactly as designed. But as the doors of the vault swing shut, sealing away billions of dollars of unseen beauty, one question remains unanswered. If a masterpiece is locked in a dark room where no one can ever look at it, does it still have any value at all?